that Leviathan is a mythological creature that God is still creating. Postmodernism is dead. Black Theology Liberation by James Cone. So, I am going to be talking about a few different things in this live stream, mostly related to theology, Bible, ministry, and stuff like that. I have 3 Bible and ministry classes, and I've been doing a lot in relation to all of that. So I have definitely a couple of updates to share with that, and some of the research and studying that I've been doing. So that's what we'll be talking about on this live stream. If you have a question, please feel free to comment. Feel free to interact with me. I'd love to talk about it with you guys and interact with anyone who is going to be joining me for this. By way of update, I have a couple things to share with you guys. So I do content for the Church of the Clyde Park Church of Nazarene. They have a YouTube channel and a Facebook account that you guys can go check out, but I'm currently and mostly working in their on their YouTube channel. And I'm going to be starting a series on there going through several different things regarding Old Testament wisdom literature. So it's going to be things like wisdom as it's seen in the Old Testament. We're going to probably touch on the New Testament as well, and other things relating to that. So I'm going to be doing that video series. I'm doing it as part of an assignment for my Old Testament wisdom class, but it's also going to be part of this series that I'm doing for the Nazarene Church. I just got my script for the first video approved by the pastor. So now it's just up to me to record the video, edit that video, and get it published on there. It's going to be a big teaching video, just an introduction to Old Testament wisdom, the concept of wisdom in the Old Testament, the wisdom literature. So this definitely includes things like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, but is typically also taken to include Song of Solomon and some or all of the Psalms as well. And if you're a Catholic or Orthodox Christian, you're going to include the Book of Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus, also known as Sirach or the Wisdom of Ben Sira. So speaking of that, those other books, the books that Catholics and Orthodox accept as scripture, but Protestants don't, I wrote an article on the Book of Sirach going through some of the things that it teaches and kind of outline a couple of different things that line up with the biblical text and some things that don't. So if you're interested in that article, you can go to medium.com and check out my account on there where I have a whole bunch of articles. I think I'm close to 40 articles now that you guys can check out. And you can also go to followstheshepherd.org and look up Sirach, type that in the search bar, and you should be able to find it as well. So yeah, I would definitely encourage you guys to check that out if you're curious about the extra biblical wisdom literature. I also wrote an article a few months ago, actually, on the Book of Wisdom, also known as the Wisdom of Solomon. The text seems to attribute it to Solomon, even though we're pretty confident that it is not written by Solomon. And in there, it makes a lot of really interesting claims. It seems influenced by Greek philosophical thought as well. And so I wrote that article for another class that I was in, but that's up there as well, and it also goes through some of the teaching there of the Book of Wisdom and looks at what is scriptural in there and what is not. And I make the case that for a few different reasons we should not have the Book of Wisdom or Sirach in the canon. I might do a video talking about the extra biblical wisdom literature because I do think it's fascinating, sort of some of the developments that take place outside of the Protestant canon with respect to the concept of wisdom. I find that really fascinating. So yeah, go ahead and check that out. Again, go to the Clyde Park Church of Nazarene YouTube channel. Check out the series that's going to be coming up on Old Testament wisdom. It's going to be really fun, and I have a lot of ideas about what I'm going to do there. So for this video, I want to talk about some of the things that I've been talking about in class, I've been writing about, making videos about, and stuff like that. So all loosely related to Bible, ministry, and theology. So that's what we will mainly be focusing on for this live stream. Thank you to anyone who's joining me for this. I really appreciate it. Don't be afraid to share this live and give me a follow. One of the things I wanted to talk about was Psalm 104. So Psalm 104 is a psalm that was created to basically praise God for the creation. That's the entire point of the psalm. In fact, it begins by praising God and ends too by praising God. There's a lot of really interesting concepts that come out in this psalm. And so I decided that for my Old Testament wisdom class, I was going to write a paper on this psalm. So because there's a lot of topics that I wanted to research that come up in it. So stuff like Leviathan is one of them. So in Psalm 104, verse 26, I'm reading out of the what translation is this? I'm reading out of the Good News Bible that has the extra biblical books in it. I just find it's like an easy to read translation. So like if I just want to pick up and read the text, I will pick up this translation. There's good like marginal space for you to write stuff in and highlight and all of that. I will just a quick note on this translation. I will say that it will oftentimes interpret for you. Now, all translations have to do some interpretive work in order to translate the text correctly. Several different scholars have noted this, but what the Good News the Good News Bible does, what this translation does, seem to go beyond that. And there are some points like in Genesis 6 where it very clearly is interpreting the text for you rather than just translating the text. So yeah, make note of that. The New Living Translation does a similar thing. It'll very much just interpret the text for you instead of just translating in a few different places. But that is one concern I have about the Good News Translation, which I've been using for a minute. But I think it's a good devotional translation, good, easy to read, so kids and teens can also just pick it up and read it and be fine. That said, though, back to Psalm 104, in verse 26, it says, "The ships sail on it being the sea, and in it plays Leviathan, that sea monster which you made," you referring to God. So the psalm is depicting a situation in which the sea is filled with creatures that live within it, and Leviathan being one of these creatures, and the ships are able to go on the sea and not be harmed by Leviathan. The picture here is of a sort of beauty, a peace, and a harmony that exists with those that travel on the sea and those creatures that are in the sea, all of which God has made, including Leviathan. So that's a beautiful picture and depiction of creation, but one of the things I'm interested in is the character of Leviathan. I've heard a lot of different things over the years. Back in my young Earth creationist days, I would have said that Leviathan is a dinosaur, and so I would have thought that Leviathan was a real creature, a dinosaur that lived, that was alive during the time of Job. And other young Earth creationists hold that perspective as well, although not everyone does. At another point, I've heard interpretations like this is just like a hyperbolic depiction of a creature, maybe a crocodile or something like that, which I've heard, and scholarship has actually, some scholars have made that case. have tried to make that argument. One thing that has come up as well was that Leviathan is a mythological creature. So the idea here is that this creature, which appears in the Bible, but also in extra biblical sources, we see the Leviathan show up in the Baal cycle. Creatures like it appear as far back, I think, prior to 2000 BC. There's sort of a lot of material that we have outside the Bible that we can use to inform our interpretation of Leviathan as is depicted in the text. And a lot of scholars, because of this, have come to the conclusion that this is a mythological and literary figure, meaning that Leviathan served symbolic purposes. It was a symbol of evil and chaos and disorder, which the gods, maybe Baal or someone else, would defeat in order to demonstrate their creating order and harmony and so on in the cosmos. If you read the Enuma Elish, which is a creation text that has parallels to Genesis and other texts in the Hebrew Bible, Marduk, the god here, defeats Tiamat, which is also depicted as like a watery chaos dragon monster thing. Leviathan serves this purpose in the ancient world, and so some scholars have said that as well. In this paper that I'm writing for class, I take this position. So I think in this text, Leviathan is not being depicted as a real sea monster that the psalmist, whenever this psalm was written, there's no superscription for this psalm. That's another really interesting thing about it. So I actually don't know how scholars date it yet. That's something I'm going to be researching as I'm writing this paper. But let's just say, for example, it was written by David in the 10th century BC. David isn't saying here that you could go out and see Leviathan if you go out into the sea in 10th century BC. Rather, Leviathan here is serving a literary purpose, and the purpose is to demonstrate the diversity as well as the harmony of God's sea creatures, of the sea creatures that God has made. And so that's what I think is going on here so far. I'm still researching, writing the paper, so my conclusion may change, and I'm also, willing to look at the evidence and change my views. But yeah, as of now, I think in this particular text, he's serving a literary purpose, and that seems to be well supported by the scholarship, both like conservative Christian and also some non-Christian scholarship as well. Another thing relating to this psalm that I am currently studying is verse 35, which says, may sinners be destroyed from the earth, may the wicked be no more. And when I first read this struck me as strange, because the entire psalm is about praising God for creation, and it's demonstrating the from the perspective of the psalmist, the peace and the harmony and so on that is in God's creation, and is he not worthy of praise for that? However, it just makes two sentences about sinners, and that's weird. That doesn't seem to have anything to do with what's going on in the psalm. But many scholars have noted the literary structure of this psalm is beautiful and is fascinating and joins ideas together and all this sort of stuff. So my question became, okay, so let's not assume that the psalmist brings this up for no reason, right? What is the relationship between sinners and God's creation? And sinners, creation, and God, right? What is the place of sinners in creation theology as represented in this psalm? So that's been some fascinating research as well. I'm making some connections to Genesis 1 and Genesis 6, when God, in Genesis 1, of course, God takes pleasure in creation, calls it very good or very beautiful. in Genesis 6, we see that he does not take pleasure in creation because of the wickedness, because of the sinners and the sins that they are committing. The evil in their heart, of course, is continual. And so I'm making some connections there to try to figure out why this brief passage about sinners is here in this creation psalm. So that was a really interesting thing to look into as well. There's a couple other things I want to look at. We see, for example, in verse 30, but when you give them breath, they are created. You give new life to the earth. And at least in this psalm, this verse here, it sounds like the psalmist thinks from his perspective that God is still creating. Which is fascinating, because there certainly is theology around this in the Christian tradition about the idea that God's not done in not just with creation, but he's not done creating. That work that he did in the first 6 days continues after the day of rest. And so I put that question there, and that's something I'm going to look into in my paper, and how that can relate to some of the ideas that we see in the Christian tradition and other biblical texts. Historical context is going to be really important. Remember that ancient Israel did not exist in a vacuum. A lot of what ancient Israel thought and believed parallels or relates to, in some way, either agreeing or disagreeing with surrounding cultures. So if you do a deep dive into Genesis 1, you'll see this. There are parallels between Genesis 1 and creation texts like the Enuma Elish. I had to do an assignment for class where you study the similarities and differences between the two. I noted if you do a study in Psalm 104, you'll see that as well, parallels between this and other texts where the gods are doing things and that sort of thing. Leviathan, as I mentioned, is a figure that's not unique to Israelite concepts of the cosmos. This is all over the place in Canaanite and Mesopotamian literature. So to understand the culture and what you're reading, especially since we are 2,000 plus years removed from anything that looked like ancient Israelite society, context, and so on, you will need to get that background literature. So the IVP, Bible Background Commentary on the Old Testament, is a really good book for that. That's the one I use a lot. I would use the NIV application commentary, and the Expositor's Bible commentary will also touch on some of those things for you as well and help you interpret the text. So I think that's a really big thing. Another big thing to remember is that we don't have to agree with everything the authors thought. Now, that might sound weird. You're like, well, what the heck? I thought the Bible was infallible and inerrant, right? Not saying it's not. What I mean is that, like, especially if you look at the wisdom literature, again, which is what I'm looking at in relation to the Old Testament currently, you see, like, slavery across the law, the wisdom literature, the historical books. They don't see a problem with it, right? Ancient Israel doesn't see a problem with slavery in various forms: debt servitude, chattel slavery, corvée labor. Solomon uses corvée labor to build the temple in I believe it's in the book of Kings, First Kings, where that's mentioned. So there's that. Ancient Israel's living in an honor and shame culture. So when you're reading the Proverbs about, the character of the good wife, for example, what part of the reason why she's good is, or maybe a result of her being a good wife, is that she brings honor to the family, right? So a bad wife brings shame upon her husband and upon her family. And we don't live in that kind of culture. We live in a hedonistic individual culture where the individual is important and prioritized, and where the good or bad character of the son doesn't actually necessarily reflect on the parents. We understand that parents can be good, but the children can still turn out bad. We understand the parents can be Christian, but the child can turn out non-Christian through no fault of the parent. Especially in a more digital age where the child can find all kinds of and access all sorts of things, and come to disbelieve in the Bible and other things. So yeah, I would keep the historical cultural context in mind. And hopefully that will help you in your studies and the resources too. Like I said, the IVP, Bible background commentary on the Old Testament, why can't I talk? The NIV application commentary and the Expositor's Bible commentary will, I think, do very good for you in that. And I mean, that's an interpretive thing in general. Like, you need the cultural historical context for the Old and New Testament. Like, it's really helpful in both cases. I'm just saying in the Old Testament particular one because that was your question. But secondly, because it's really important for like when you're reading a passage and it says something that sounds like scientifically untrue, for example, about the cosmos. Well, it's helpful to keep in mind that in the context, ancient Israel thought very differently about the cosmos than we do. And to sort of not have a problem with that, you have to be able to say and understand, as much of the scholarship has argued, that God is sort of accommodating ancient Israel in both theological, moral, and scientific ideas, and will speak their language in order to communicate truth. Right. So, but yeah, so keep those things in mind. Going back to the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, I am also writing a paper on Psalm 88. In my Old Testament wisdom class, we have a exegetical paper that we have to write. This is like a big 3,000 word paper where we have to, engage in solid methods of exegesis and hermeneutics, or biblical interpretation, in order to figure out what the passage is telling us. And, how do you apply the passage and that sort of thing. I chose Psalm 88 for a couple reasons. So, backstory, I do devotionals on Sundays as a way of resting in God and in His presence and His Word. And one of the devotional passage I had for a particular Sunday was Psalm 88. So I read through it, and it really spoke to me because, it's one of the few Psalms that's just doom and gloom. There's a range of emotion that is expressed in the Psalms. If you read them, it'll be, praise God, I'll rejoice in you always. My heart is filled with joy. Things are great. And then there's stuff like lament Psalms or Psalm 88 where they're accusing God of the analogy in one of the Psalms is like shooting arrows at them, striking them. They're surrounded by enemies, or they're filled with sickness, and they are pleading to God, and sometimes God's not hearing them and all that. So there are some lament psalms, as they're called. And this one, Psalm 88, is the most depressing of the psalms. There is very little hope in them. One of the scholars actually who talks about the Psalms, I forget his name, but I cite him in my paper, and that's going to become available as an article that you guys can read. He said he calls this Psalm 88 an embarrassment to conventional faith. And I was like, oh, okay, well, That's really interesting. This would be worth studying. But yeah, as I was doing that devotional, it really spoke to me because I've talked about on my social media accounts, and there's more stuff in my private life I could talk about. But I have a lot of experience with depression and anxiety and these other things for various reasons. And sometimes, it's hard to be a Christian and to go through those things. I've also seen people in my life who are really close to me basically suffering my entire life. Like my earliest memories of them are them going through a lot of physically trying times. And so as such, this cry and this plea for help in the midst of this darkness and God seemingly not hearing them from the psalmist's perspective really did speak to me there. So I think Psalm 88 can have some powerful devotional and pastoral application to it. So if you guys I would encourage you guys, if you guys are suffering, if you guys are going through a trying time, if you're struggling with doubts in your faith, please feel free to read Psalm 88 because you see that. And even the kind of plea, the dark and sad plea for help that's here in this Psalm, is an expression of faith. I watch a lot of cinema, like movies, TV shows, all that stuff. I talk about it on my accounts as well. And one scene that struck me that kind of relates to what I just said is when in Supernatural, Dean Winchester, one of the main characters, is praying to God. And the angel Castiel comes to him and says, like, even this like accusatory, almost sounds like blasphemous prayer is still an expression of faith. And we see that idea here in Psalm 88. And that was the application I made to myself during the devotional, and I really appreciated it. I decided to make this the passage for my exegetical paper for Old Testament wisdom. So I will be talking about that as well. Like I said, that paper, when it's finished, will become an article that you guys can check out. Published both on followstheshepherd.org and medium.com. In my preaching and teaching class, we have to give 2 like mock sermons or teaching times. We kind of choose what to name it based on the audience that we're speaking to for this mock sermon. But I decided to talk about death and mortality because I've been doing a lot of research into Genesis, 1 Corinthians 15, and Romans 5 regarding death, mortality, creation, Adam, and that sort of thing, because a little while ago I came to accept evolution, and one of the reasons for that was because I saw, like, in the creation story and the New Testament's reflection on that, you see death and mortality, not physical death and immortality anyway, not as a intrusion as a result of sin, but because of the fact that we are creatures with bodies. And so the sort of mock sermons are going to be sermons about that theme in Genesis. Is going to be the first one, and then the second sermon is going to be about 1 Corinthians 15, and that's kind of where I'm going to bring up the gospel and how Jesus and his resurrection, and then our resurrection as a result of joining him, fixes the problem that we have in that we die because we are mortal, and we are mortal because of Adam being created from the dust. Adam has a quote unquote dusty body, as we all do. The Psalms, one of the Psalms, I forget the number, but one of the Psalms will say that God, remembers that we are dust, right? He remembers that we are mortals and ultimately, and definitely by his standards, weak and frail, and so on. So I'm also currently writing an article about this as well. I have an article on death and mortality in Genesis 1 through 3 that you guys can check out. But my sixth article in what I'm calling the evolutionary creationism series is going to be on death and mortality and Paul. The basic conclusion here is that that I can say here is that 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about physical death, but the reason why we die physically is because we have the image, you might say, of Adam's body, who was created from dust. He cites Genesis 2:17 or 2:7, excuse me, when Adam is created from dust and breathed into. And this exact argument is made in Jewish texts prior to Paul, or around the time of Paul, sometimes called the Thanksgiving hymns. There are these Jewish hymns, and they make the same argument. So there's some good background literature to this that informs our reading there of First Corinthians 15. So that is my case in 1 Corinthians 15. In Romans 5:12 through 21, where Paul again is making this typological compare and contrast between Adam and Christ, I think Paul is talking about moral death and eschatological death. So I actually think he's talking about multiple kinds of death in 1 Corinthians 5:12 through 21. He's certainly not talking about physical death, because the comparison, the contrast rather, made between Adam and Christ is different in Romans 5, and so different that I think it merits a different understanding of the death that he's talking about here. At least in 1 Corinthians 15, you can make the case that it's physical death because, he's talking about the body. He's talking about the resurrection, right? These are physical events and physical things. So you can make that case from the context a bit easier there. In Romans 5, I think it's a lot harder. I think you have to do some assuming in order to get that outcome. A lot of scholars, though, who do take the physical death interpretation will still tell you that's not the only death he's talking about. Some of them are going to argue for spiritual death. Others are going to say that eschatological death is in view. But Paul is talking about multiple kinds of death and life to contrast Adam to Christ. So whatever kind of death he's talking about, I think the contrast he makes here is very different than 1 Corinthians 15, and thus warrants a different understanding of death. And that fits the background literature. In the Second Temple Jewish literature that we have, a lot of them think about death differently, even physical death differently, where physical death, what they mean is loss of immortality, right? Or they mean premature or violent death, and these other things. They could also mean spiritual death or moral death as well. So, yeah, I make that case in the article, which you guys can check out once I'm able to finish it and get that published. But so that's what my sermon is going to be talking about. Of course, all of this pointing to Jesus and the gospel, that we are saved, and that the heart of Christianity is not going to heaven. It's not avoiding hell. It's resurrection. It's joining Christ in both body and soul glorified. And so it's a wonderful and beautiful message. And Genesis and themes of death and mortality, I think, point to that. The other class that I have is ministry in postmodernity. So essentially, there are many different historical periods that have occurred over time. So think we have the medieval era, we have the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, right? Traditional stuff. Well, we've also had and especially in Western culture, we've had in American culture modernism, and then there was a point in time where we had postmodernism as like the dominant cultural thing. But this class is basically acknowledging sort of the current times, in that postmodernism is dead, and that its spectral ghost, is still kind of around, but is ultimately dead. And so we're in a different cultural, artistic, spiritual, and religious period now. And so we need to define that period, learn about it, learn its complexities, and then figure out how to do ministry in light of it. So that's basically what the class is about. What killed postmodernism? How do you know? I forget the if you there's a 2012 book called Supplementing the Postmodern. That's the textbook we're using for class. You can also check out Brendan Graham Dempsey. He has a YouTube channel where he talks about this stuff as well. But essentially, like, by the time the 90s came, there were scholars and important figures who were speaking about postmodernism in the past tense, like what we were in. And so that's been acknowledged in the scholarship. Someone, I believe in 2001, I forget her name, but again, check out the Brendan Graham Dempsey's After Postmodernism series on YouTube. He cites her in this video, but she says that she basically says the same thing. Like, yeah, postmodernism is pretty much over now. We're in a different cultural period, and we need to have a name that fits this period best. And a lot of people have said that this term, this name, that best fits this period is metamodernism. And so, but there's a lot of other terms, like, it's a whole thing. So there are people who just aren't postmodernists. That means it died. It's more, it's that, but it's more. It's not just that people aren't postmodernists anymore. It's that as a cultural, artistic, and philosophical expression, postmodernism and its ideas aren't the major player anymore. It has died in that sense, especially artistically. A lot of people, a lot of artists and painters and so on are moving into metamodernist forms of art, and the Stuckists were also people who noted that postmodernism was dead, and noted that we needed to kind of return to a kind of art that postmodernism didn't have. And so it tried to do a revival of sort of modernist or traditional art as well. So yeah. Now it's dead, yes, but like its ghost and it's certainly here in some sense. Its ghost, its spectral form, is still around. Again, read the book Supplementing the Postmodern. That came out in 2012. There have been developments since, I think, the pandemic, and all of the chaos that happened during the pandemic really did a lot to culture, artistic expressions, and religious and spiritual concepts, as well as like digimodernist culture and a bunch of other things. But yeah, so yeah, postmodernism is seen as dead in that sense. But like I said, its ghost is still around. You'll still find people who are saying, truth is subjective. This is your, it's cool, that's your truth, but that's not my truth. As like a philosophical expression, you barely see postmodern art now, to my knowledge. But it's still partly there. You do see a little bit of that deconstructionist, deconstructing modern and traditional thought in movies and shows. but a lot of it takes a metamodern approach, and that's sort of become the new cultural period that we are in. They are Stoics now. They are fatalists now. They didn't die. Sounds like you're making claims. What did it do? Well, I am making claims, but like it's not without evidence. The scholarship on this has, and the people who are very culturally literate and aware of the times, have been saying this for like over a decade. It has been over a decade that people have been speaking about postmodernism in the past tense and saying it's dead. That's not just a me thing. Again, check out Brennan Graham Dempsey's After Postmodernism. Check out supplementing the postmodern. They talk about trying to define this new cultural era, and they use terms like postmodernism, metamodernism, digimodernism. There's a whole bunch of other things. Okay, define metamodernism. How is it functionally different? That's a great question. So, metamodernism is a new cultural framework, which is attempting to take seriously all other past historical periods, which is like traditional, modern, postmodern, and so on, and create something new and sort of reconstruct something. In a TikTok live where I don't have the material and the resources in front of me, I think that's the best way that I could probably describe it. So just one example. It takes the postmodern critique of the meta-narrative, right? This idea that like history and all these other things is a part of some grand narrative. Often, this related to the Christian tradition, of course, because we think that like the cosmos and the history of the world is a divine drama, as we see throughout the biblical text, and God's dealing with the world, right? So all pointing to Jesus and what he's done and what he'll do in the future. So that's like a big meta narrative. The postmodernists philosophically wanted to critique that and deconstruct that. The issue was that postmodernism didn't reconstruct. It didn't reform. So all it did was break down culturally, artistically, and philosophically, broke down several different ideas, including something like the meta-narrative, but it didn't reconstruct. It didn't try to build something new. And you see this come out in some of their art and stuff. Did not always take things seriously. It's characterized by a lack of sincerity, you might say. Metamodernism, on the other hand, while taking the postmodern deconstruction of the meta-narrative seriously, taking critiques seriously, also wants to say that there is a meta-narrative. And so metamodern Christianity that Brendan Dempsey argues for, or has articulated, does have a meta-narrative and concepts of truth, meaning, especially meaning, given the meaning crisis that we're in, and all the things that relate to that. Metamodernism wants to say like those are valid terms and those mean something, right? Those are good, true concepts that we should be having and holding on to. Spiritual, right? Spiritual concepts it wants to maintain, that sort of thing. So the metamodern and metamodernists want to take the criticisms of the past historical period seriously, but attempt something new. And so that's, for the most part, this is kind of the cultural period that we're in. And so because, though, metamodernism isn't just like trying to destroy postmodernism, it's trying to take it seriously. Postmodernist concepts are still going to come around. So I don't see, metamodernism is not characterized by like a killing of the past historical periods or its concepts. They want to, it's been described as a oscillation, a going back and forth between traditional, modern, postmodern ideas. It's been described by the scholarship as this pluralistic, sort of taking in all of this and trying to do something with it. So that's what separates postmodernism from metamodernism. Again, check out the resources that I just mentioned. Brendan Dempsey's After Postmodernism series on YouTube, and supplementing the postmodern are scholarly resources and resources that cite scholarship on the death of postmodernism, the cultural periods we're in now, how those periods are different than what came before, how do we relate to them, all that sort of stuff. You can find the scholarship on that. So Ministry After Postmodernity is a class that wants to figure out how to do ministry in this period. Like, how do we do ministry after postmodernism? And I find that to be like really fascinating, a really fascinating question. It was really complicated at first. Like I said, this is a 3.5-hour block class, and there's so much into this subject. There's so much relating to this subject matter. But at least for me personally, not everyone in the class, but at least for me, at this point, I feel like I handle enough on what we've learned so far in class, such that I can, talk about it in a TikTok live. Those are the kind of things that I'm learning about in class and thinking about and doing research on. Outside of class, this is interesting. So as me and my professor were talking about postmodernism, I brung up like feminist theology and Black liberation theology, because I've heard that these two theological movements have accepted sort of postmodern philosophical thought, is like incorporating that into a theology. And so I was really interested about that. I was really interested in the idea of Black liberation theology or Black theology as a, Black Christian. I've heard a lot of things, of course. And so my professor gave me this book. This is Liberation, a Black Theology of Liberation by James Cone. That is the original 1970 publication that I have. It's been, 50 years since that book was originally published, and it's gone through editions and like anniversary editions at this point and stuff. But this is the original. I want to get my hands on the other editions at some point to kind of figure out what he says later, see if he updates the discussions and what he says in the original book. So the plan right now, though, is to read that, which, again, I'm very interested in. And then after that, I'm going to read this. This is advocating for justice and evangelical vision for transforming systems and structures. It's not exactly like the same topic, but I think, there is like I find the subject matter connected in a way. So I would love to see, I'm reading both of these and seeing how they both handle maybe the struggles of minority communities, or, how Christians theologically and practically can engage some of this stuff. But James's book, I have read pages 18 through 23 so far, and I'm concerned. I made a video talking about some of my concerns, so you guys can go check that out on my TikTok account again, and my other socials. So feel free to check me out on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff. And I'm gonna obviously withhold all of my comments until I've at least read all of the original publication. But I'm really like, I'm in part frustrated because like a theology that's done in the context of Black people in America, I'm not mad about. I think if you're a Christian and you apply the Bible to your life, you're doing contextual theology. So, I mean, I have no problem with applying the Bible to Black people, obviously, both corporately and individually. I think what James is doing is more than that, and it's not obvious to me that he's um, engaging in a close reading of the biblical text, or some of these other. He doesn't have some of these other biblical or theological concerns in mind. So, yeah, I'm interested though to see what he does with that. So that's another thing that I'm also looking into. So yeah, in terms of the biblical, theological, and ministry material, that's kind of what I've been looking into lately. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this. I really appreciate it. And tune in next time. I don't know when I'll do my next TikTok live, but we can definitely continue these discussions related to the Bible, ministry, and Christian theology. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and have a blessed day.